All right, there's nobody else waiting in the waiting room, so we will get underway. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the DVT Insights session. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world. I think that probably reflects part of the reason why you are on the call today. If you haven't attended a DVT Insights session before, these sessions are typically conducted by folks that work with DVT or in the vicinity of DVT in terms of the industries and sectors that we service. And in particular, they represent expertise and particular opportunities, both with technology and within business, that make a fundamental difference to digital business today. In terms of what everybody's experience has been over the last 12 months, and we won't spend too much time giving any credit to COVID, but things have certainly changed, both in terms of where folks are working, the conditions they're working in, but within organizations too that have had to respond to those conditions. And it's meant having to make significant decisions really quickly and make dramatic changes in terms of how organizations operate and how the people within those organizations operate. In our history as a business, we've been very much involved in digital transformation and agile transformation within organizations, introducing agile philosophy and approaches to how the organization actually runs. But for the most part, that had always been driven by the approach in terms of projects and specifically technology projects. These days, I think many businesses and organizations are appreciating that the agile factor and agility within the business is another whole dimension that needs to be there in order to be able to respond to events such as COVID and the conditions that come with them and the requirements for rapid change and implementation of decision-making that's effective and aligned with what is needed strategically and tactically and within very short spaces of time. That doesn't come from the traditional command and control type structures with somebody at the very top of the pyramid providing the direction and then that filtering down. It takes too long to do that. Additionally, the expectations of people are now being realigned with the timeframes that have been experienced in the past 12 months. Rapid decision-making, localized decision-making, and the ability to shift the business really quickly as required by both environmental, commercial, legislative, and other conditions that fundamentally are changing almost daily around businesses, organizations, and indeed communities. So rather than having you have to listen to me, we have some expertise that is being shared with us today by Saret Marais. Saret is someone that we highly respect in the Agile field, and particularly in terms of looking at the implementation of Agile within organizations. So we welcome Saret this morning to lead this session. And certainly through the course of the session, I would encourage you to raise any questions on the chat side of things. We will get to those as well. But without any further ado, I'll hand over to Saret and we will have the session with her. Thank you so much for joining, Saret. Over to you.
Thank you, Cole. And thank you very much for having me today. Agile transformation is a topic which is very close to my heart. But I find that as we start on this journey, we often just think about the sort of flashy, quick things we can do. Like, how do I set up these product teams and appoint scrum masters and you start running? And we don't really think about how Agile is going to fit into our organizations and how we manage it when it starts to scale. So that is what I am going to be talking about today. I am going to try and share my screen. Full disclaimer before I begin. I use Microsoft Teams all day, every day. I think all of us use some sort of a platform at this stage. I don't use Zoom often, so if this is an epic fail, you know, I apologize. Okay. There we go. I'm just going to ask that if you can't see my screen, you just let me know. So, yes, the topic I'm going to talk about today is Agile Portfolio Management, the art of herding cats. And why I refer to it as the art of herding cats is, of course, we know that cats cannot be herded. And as you start scaling Agile, you'll stumble across a few challenges which will make you feel like product teams cannot be herded either. But we'll chat about that a bit and talk about some of the things that I've experienced and how I've tackled this challenge. So, I mean, to start off with, I want to talk about why Agile. You mentioned it in the intro call, and I think it's so important. Agility is incredibly important in our organizations today. And I think that all of us need to respond to change in a quicker way. We're all aware of it. We're all experiencing competitors who are perhaps have a quicker speed to market, or who is just better at getting what customers want to them, or just feels like they're crushing entire industries. A lot of these new disruptors who are coming in just have a unique and much better customer experience, as an example, right? And so I think all of us are trying to think about, how do we respond to change in a faster way, and how do we become more agile? And so, agility is that ability of ours to respond to change, and agile really is a way of work to get us there. I'm going to talk about some of the examples which got us to a place where we started thinking about agile. And it's such a pity we're not in a room together, because if we were, I would have just asked all of you to raise your hands if you have ever experienced any of the following. And if there is anybody who wouldn't raise their hand by the end of this, or who virtually wouldn't raise their hand by the end of this, please come talk to me, because I want to understand how you got to a place where you haven't experienced any of these frustrations. But basically things like projects get delivered, and then the project team moves on to the next project. And so what happens as a result of that is all that IP moves on with them to the next project. And you deliver something, and like a few weeks later you go, oh, maybe we should change this. And very respectfully, everybody around you, including your PMO, tells you that the business analyst who designed this is unfortunately now working on something else and can only come back to this at some unspecified date in the future. Another challenge, technology is a bottleneck in your organization. And Cole, you spoke about digital, and a lot of my talk is going to be focused around the digital elements of agile transformation, and how I've approached this specifically for digital teams. But digital teams are as much of a bottleneck. So you have these tech and these digital teams who essentially feel like they're holding everything back, because everything has to go through them. Testing is another great example. So a project gets delivered, and then it gets thrown across the wall, and someone's supposed to now test something that has been in development for 6 months or longer. And by the time you get to testing, you kind of don't recognize what you're testing anymore, because since you wrote the original business requirements document months and months ago, everything's changed. You've had significant scope creep. None of that scope creep is documented. And now you're sort of going like, okay, this is really what I want. Key man dependencies we've spoken about a bit. And then of course, my favorite, which is the elephant in the room, which is sometimes we finish things just because we started them. I mean, I've certainly experienced this, like huge programs where you start building it and you get to a point where you've invested like 18 months worth of effort in something. And when you look at it, I'm not quite sure whether it really solves your business problem anymore, but hey, we're there. We did what we thought we were going to do. Let's just get it over the line, right? So we don't stop when we need to stop. So certainly those are some of the challenges that I've experienced. And specifically when I was working for a large bank, we got to a place where we realized that if we keep going on this route, we weren't going to be more agile as a business, and we certainly weren't going to deliver what customers wanted us to deliver in the right way. So something had to change. And of course, as you start thinking about how do I change my organization? How do I start doing things differently? So in our case, we then started thinking about maybe we should think about more agile ways of working, more agile ways of delivering. And as you start thinking about new ways of doing things, of course, there will be a lot of people who will try and tell you what you should be doing differently. And a lot of them are consultants, and they can show you beautiful pictures like this one. So what's on the screen is the Spotify model for how they get their engineering teams to work together more effectively. And the basic principle, and I think most of you would have come across something similar to this by now, is that what you do is you take your teams and you divide them into these ring-fenced product teams. And a product team is a product owner. It has designers, it has developers, potentially has a scrum master, and they work together. And in Spotify's world, they call that a squad. And when you have a whole bunch of squads working together, it rolls up into what is a tribe. So if I'm going to use some bank examples just to make it real, if you have like 4 different product teams delivering on things for home loans, you could have a home loans tribe. But within that model, because teams will be working virtually together in a cross-functional way every day, you want to make sure that you retain their specific skills and expertise. So you put them into chapters where, for example, all of the business analysts form a business analysis chapter, and that allows them to share specific skills about what they're responsible for, share that with each other, learn from each other, and grow together. And then there's this concept in their model called the guild, which it's just a bunch of people who are interested in a similar topic. So for example, everybody who's interested in artificial intelligence, regardless of what your role is, would then get together and talk about how you could apply that in practice. I think someone has their hand raised. I'm going to just pause and ask whether there's a question at this point, or should I rather, I think we said leave them until the end. Please put your questions in the chat. Please put your questions in the chat.
If anybody does have a question, Saret has said, please just drop those in on the chat side of things, and I will keep a log of those and share those towards the end of the session. Thank you, Pete.
Perfect. Okay. So as I mentioned, we sort of then said, okay, we need to do a new way of doing things. The Spotify model was sort of put on the table as a way of working. And of course, those of us who have been on the Agile journey for a while knows that what Spotify was actually trying to do was just showcase their framework and show people how they are doing things from a way of working perspective. And it was never intended to be a model that people now implement, but a lot of people did, right? And what was nice about seeing it visually like this is that it made it real in a different way. So we could really start thinking about what would Agile look like inside of our organization. And that was great. But what I want to be super clear about is that what I'm going to talk about today is not going to be about methodology at all. I think that, and I sort of put this picture on the screen for a specific reason, because it seems very methodology-like. This is what your team should look like. This is what they should be called. And actually, the first thing that I found in terms of Agile journeys is that you should step away from methodology. Okay? Because everyone's going to try to sell you SAFe or Kanban or DevOps or, Scrum. And those are all great ways of working, but it's much more important to just take it and make it practical for your organization. And if you try to be too clinical about applying a specific Agile methodology, you will probably get to a place where you just start tripping yourself up. It's much more important when rolling out Agile to think about what are the principles I can take from each of these frameworks and methodologies that people are showing me that I can apply practically and realistically in my organization today in order to start operating in a different way. But of course, as we start with Agile, there's this concept of you're going to have these autonomous product teams. They're going to be very clearly ring-fenced. You're going to have like one specific team with one specific priority. And we call these, in some cases, they get called pizza box teams. And the premise there is that your Agile product team should never be bigger than the amount of people it takes to eat one pizza. Now, it is clear that this principle was designed by Americans, where you can actually have 8 people eat one pizza. It's certainly not going to work with South African pizza sizes, but there we go. So pizza box teams. And they're a really good way to start. And I think that as you start with Agile, this is probably the right place to begin. Try doing this with one team and then seeing how that works out for you. So define a specific business challenge that you want to solve, go and ring fence a team to solve it in an Agile way. But now here's the thing, and this is why I say that you can't really apply methodologies in a clean way. Pure Agile means that this team would be completely ring-fenced and not working on anything else. They would determine what value is that they want to deliver for their customers. They would determine how long it's going to take them to do this and what success looks like. Like if we had to apply this in a purely theoretical way, now that's great, but we all work for, or I think a lot of us work for large organizations. And the reality is that in a large organization, someone is paying for this. Somebody has an expectation that by a certain date, some measure of value is going to be delivered to customers at a specific cost. And when you get to that place, it becomes really important to start thinking about how you do your planning around Agile, which is sort of that portfolio management concept that we're going to be chatting a bit about today. Because the reality is that, as I said, when you have one team and they look like the team on the screen, very simple, very clean, very clear, they can get on with things. But you very quickly realize that when you're rolling this out in a real organization who had a different way of doing things in the past, that this team would have to fit into a system which already exists. And that system probably has different processes for infrastructure management. This team is probably dependent on another team to deliver something before they can start. And very quickly you get to a place where you have reality, which is that all of these different product teams are dependent on each other. These interdependencies start coming in really, really strongly. You have external pressure that you wouldn't have in a pure tech company where they release thousands of lines of code every morning. Like, for example, you have to plan your marketing campaign and you really want to get this out before Christmas because that's when people are going to buy it. And so it doesn't really matter how many sprints your product team thinks this is going to take. You need this delivered in a specific timeline. Or if one team is delayed, it delays another team. Or your release cycle for some of your core systems looks slightly different. And so you get to this place where you just realize that in reality, product teams are interdependent. It is complex. And you now need to figure out a way to get all of your Agile teams to work together in practice. So this is where Agile portfolio management comes in. And Agile portfolio management is really important to make sure that you understand how you are going to scale Agile in an organization that has other teams that will not be Agile and that has different levels of maturity in terms of agility across the organization. And when it comes to Agile portfolio management, it's really, really complex. But above anything, it is about people. And just like with any other portfolio challenge you've ever had, the most important thing is to get people to collaborate. Now, we know that people within an organization are not herd animals. They don't want to go in one direction unless you can give them a compelling reason for why this will work for them. And the reality is that everybody who is part of that Agile portfolio will have their own agenda and their own outcome that they want to achieve. And so if you take sort of only one point out of this conversation today, it's first figure out how you are going to get the people to work together. First figure out how we're going to collaborate and show people that, and everybody who's involved, that this has a huge benefit for them, that doing things in a different way is in their interest. And one of the ways in which we did this at the bank is, we spoke about those challenges earlier in this chat. One of the ways in which we did this at the bank was we really just took those challenges to people and we said, are you feeling this today? Do you want things to be different? Then go on this journey with us. We are all going to learn together. We need everybody's input and buy-in. We are going to try things. Some of them will work, some of them will not work. But if we pull this off, the results will be very rewarding, and we will deliver in a completely different way, which is going to be more aligned. But the crux of it was to tell people that we are trying this together. And I think that's really important on an Agile journey, because those methodologies don't work for us like in that clean and clear-cut way when we try to implement them into existing organizations. The concept of getting everybody to decide that even in approaching things in a different way, we have to have a certain level of agility is quite critical. So that's sort of step one. Step one is to just get the buy-in from everyone and get them to collaborate on a different way. And then, of course, figure out what portfolio management problem you are trying to solve. So you've got these different Agile product teams. And if them working in isolation works for you and you feel like you're getting everything out of it that you need, then you stop your Agile journey there. You don't have to take it to the portfolio level. And in fact, in really small companies, it works quite well to just spin up a number of Agile product teams, let them do their thing, and that's it. But as you start scaling and you have more and more of these teams and you have to synchronize what happens between them, you will find that you are going to have a number of challenges at a portfolio level. And distilling that is quite critical so that you distill your approach to it as well. I can narrow it down from my experience to 3 pretty common things that start happening as you scale Agile. The first is priority. So most of us who worked in places where there were quite mature project management and program governance processes got really used to how priority was driven. So we would have, I don't know, either change councils or these planning processes, or we would take the organizational goals and divide them into programs, and there would be a finite number of them. So we would say, we're going to deliver 5 or 6 or 10 programs this year, and this is what they are, and this is what they're going to look like, and that's our priority. When you start breaking things into smaller pieces of work, like you would when you're rolling out Agile, determining priority becomes really, really, really important. And it really is a very common challenge that we see. And I'm going to use some digital examples, but if I can explain this in a bank context. As we roll out our business strategies, we realize that we need to do things differently, which we've spoken about, and then everybody jumps on to digital as this silver bullet that's going to fix everything. So now what ends up happening is that the home loans area and the vehicle and asset finance area and the transactional banking area and the business banking area, they all want all of that transactional capability on this one app. So in a bank, you have a banking app. Everybody wants everything on that one banking app. And so it just becomes this mess of priority, because now you don't have programs to fall back on from a priority perspective anymore. And everybody wants their foot in the door in some way. So we'll talk a bit about how we've solved that. The second one is cost. So again, when you move from a program construct to an Agile portfolio construct, understanding cost is quite complex. Well, no, it's not complex, it's just different. Because in a PMO traditional program construct, you would have very specific ways of dealing with cost, and everybody is really clear on how we determine what the cost of a program is. In Agile, we do that slightly differently. And then the third one is transparency. So again, if we're used to running things in a big program format, we have steercos and people do steerco reporting, and that's where you go to find out what's happening. Everything is really transparent. There's like a reporting structure, and you just need to think about how you turn that around when you start having Agile product teams, and how you start creating transparency around what they're busy with. So those are kind of the 3 big challenges that we found ourselves facing as we got more and more Agile product teams and we started scaling Agile, like those three things really started to create a little bit of friction. And I think that they're quite common problems. And so I'm going to just talk about some of the approaches that I've taken in order to solve this in previous organizations. And what's really interesting is I've since joined a new organization. I'm with Multichoice now, and we are here. And so with every new organization, you need to think about, where am I in my Agile journey, and what is the logical next step to take? So we still have some work to do on that front. But basically, I think that there are 4 principles that underpin Agile portfolio management in a way that would make it really simple for everyone to understand and really practical to roll out. The first one is to decide on your team construct quite early on. So I spoke about squads and tribes and product teams before. I'm sure that most of you have Agile product teams at some level of granularity. And as I said, they don't always have to be as small as the theory says they have to be. But decide how you are going to organize your available capacity around this Agile concept and how that will roll up. So there are a few core principles to this, and then there are a few practical ways of approaching it. The first is that we have to try and make sure that within each of our Agile teams, we have someone who's the product owner, so the person who ultimately owns this from a product perspective. And then those teams have to have representation from technology and design. So someone has to think about the customer experience, and then of course, somebody has to build it. And I think the first thing that's quite important as you start creating these teams is to keep in mind that not one of these capabilities is more important than any other capability. I found some really suboptimal ways in which people have approached this in the past, where they say that the product owner is like the mini CEO of the business and they decide what happens. The risk that you run is that then your design teams and your technology teams will not feel like they have equal footing or an equal seat at the table. So whilst the product owner does drive priority and demand and decides what goes into the backlog next, design and tech have to be right there next to them. And then we also find the sort of flip side where maybe we place too much emphasis on technology as an example, right? And what you want to do is just strike a nice balance where each of those 3 capabilities are equally important and deliver quality and value to our customers together. There are different ways of doing this. So you can focus it around like a channel, for example. So you could have a product team for your app or your website, or you can focus around a business capability. So just again, using a banking example, you could have a product team for home loans, for example. And it's important to have a core team who sort of, even as you scale, maintains the heart of either that capability or that channel. And then you can add capacity to that with other sort of satellite teams that work around it, but maintaining that core in the center. Anyway, the point around this really is just, if you create it and you create it well, then you will have a view of cost, because this team is going to work together for the entire year, solving problems for either a channel or an area of your business, and that will then be the cost of your change. And the reason why I say stick to it is it becomes very complicated when you change how your teams work and how they're like made up as you go, because then you will lose some of that velocity. If you break these teams, they will stop knowing themselves and each other and the product that they're working on as well as they should, and you'll lose some of the benefits of Agile. The second principle is make the process really clear. I mean, this is incredibly obvious. And when we drive large product or project portfolios, we are quite good at defining processes. So there are these governance models around how we do change, etc. And then when we move to Agile, sometimes we think that we won't need as many processes anymore, but we really do. So when it comes to Agile portfolio management, the sort of first principle is one intake system. That means that there must be one pipeline for prioritizing what your product teams are going to be working on. And like something that we found in the bank works quite well is if you don't allow anybody to bypass that process. Because the minute somebody can bypass the process by saying, I just want this very quickly, like everyone's just going to go to that one person and use them as a way to bypass process. So one intake system, nobody can bypass it. You have to force rank. In Agile, it's very important to know what is more important than something else, so that as the individual product teams start prioritizing their backlogs, they know what should get priority. And this process has to have two things. The first is a sort of sub-process for defining value. So how do we know whether this thing that we want to do is going to be valuable for our business, and that you do on good enough data. You don't do it on because someone wants it or because someone shouts the loudest. You sort of use the data that you have available to say, this is the value that we think we're going to get from it. And then your product teams will get their backlogs from here. I'm just gonna. So having this process is quite an important part of this. And one of the things that we made a decision to do is to say that the short-term capacity is fixed. Because that forces prioritization, but it is actually also just really important. So if you go back to the product teams that we just spoke about, you can't just quickly add more developers to just quickly solve a problem. You have to understand that if there are two things which are of equal importance, then your prioritization process has to allow for one of those things to take preference and to be delivered in your product teams first. Then the third principle is make it visible. And this is an old picture, as you will see. And of course, COVID has somewhat affected our ability to do things in this way. But essentially what I've liked doing in the past was to make the portfolio level backlogs really visible in a tangible way. So taking an entire wall of a floor and just going like, this is what the digital teams are busy with from a portfolio perspective. And the advantage to this is that anybody who wants to know where something is can literally just walk up to the wall and see, oh, here's the thing that I need for my business. It has been prioritized to be placed into a sprint in the next quarter or the one thereafter. Now I'm comfortable and I know what's going on. And I know that we can't do it in this tangible way anymore, but there are obviously digital tools for doing this as well. It's just really important to have your portfolio level information somewhere where it can be accessed by anybody who wants to know what's going on, because you will reduce a lot of overhead on your product teams by taking that responsibility away from them. So what we often found at the beginning of our Agile journey is that every person in business who had something that was being delivered by a digital team would then go to every digital product owner for an update on what is happening with their specific feature or their specific deliverable. And of course, that made those product owners very frustrated because they were dealing with multiple different people from business who needed input from them on a very regular basis. And every minute a product owner or an Agile product team is busy with reporting is a minute where, of course, they're not delivering value for our customers, right? So having this process of making it visible so that you can sync up on what's still coming, what is in the pipeline, and what is done is of paramount importance. And then the last one is keep communicating. So just like your product teams are going to have ceremonies that they stick to, so sprint planning and sprint grooming and retros and things like that, you also need to think about what are those ceremonies that you want to have at a portfolio level, and what are you going to use to communicate at a portfolio level, what is going on, what the cadence of delivery is, etc. And what's really important is that as you define those sort of ceremonies, so where do we come together, or how do we come together to talk about the progress in the portfolio as opposed to in the product teams, is to have people there who have an interest in what's going on, but also who can resolve items which can't be resolved by the individual product teams. And whether that's around prioritization or something else that's blocking them, I found that it's really useful when you have, for example, senior business stakeholders and sponsors there who, if you tell them we've got a problem with this, can then go and unpack it for you if your Scrum Master potentially couldn't do it in the sprint. And then your communication process, obviously, it's great to get everyone together. It's great to know when that's going to happen, because then there's predictability and you don't get inundated with requests throughout. But it's also good to automate a lot of your communication into sort of automated reports and things. And there are a lot of tools that you can use for this, things like Jira Portfolio, Confluence, etc. But like I said, this really isn't about specific tools or methodologies. It's about a way of work. So if Excel and PowerPoint works best for you, then that's perfectly fine as well. And if you sort of stick to, oh, and I forgot what I've got at the bottom of the slide, which is around demoing. So in a large project construct, teams would often develop something for a very long time, and then you will have sight of it. In Agile and Agile portfolios, I find that having demos every sprint or every 2 sprints is incredibly valuable, because it gives everybody a view of what you are busy with and what you are delivering, and it allows them to confirm whether that is what they meant when they said that this is what they want. So demo. If you get all of these things right, it's absolutely worth it in the end. But of course, our Agile journeys are never really done. So as I mentioned earlier, we learn as we go, we adjust as we go. And the more we adjust, the more we get to a place where we have better continuous improvement across all of our teams. We plan better. And in my mind, the most important part of this is this whole Agile journey is we get better alignment between our technology and our digital teams and business. And I am going to leave it at that. So that's just a sort of high-level overview of the principles that I found works really well in rolling out Agile journeys. And I am glad to see that we have some time for a few questions.
Saret, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, we already have a first question coming through, and I'll just remind our audience, if you do want to raise a question for Saret, please just drop that in the chat window and we will get that out to you. First question, Saret, I hope you're ready for this. Looks like an incredibly difficult one from Milani. What is the #1 reason in your experience for an Agile transformation journey failing?
I mean, I don't know whether I could narrow it down to one, Milani, and I'd actually really like your answer on that as well. So I look forward to attending your session in a few weeks' time. But I think if I have to narrow it down to a few, it's obviously buy-in. I spoke about how this really is about people. And if you get the people in your organization to buy into the concept of doing things differently in order to achieve a different or better outcome, then you win. But if they don't buy in, it doesn't matter how many Agile tools you go and buy or how many consultants you get to come and spin up squads, you're never going to get there. So sort of buy in from the top, buy in from inside the teams. If I had to narrow it down, that would be it.
Thank you, Saret. Zane has a question as well, and that is, what key metrics have you used in the past to measure the success of Agile transformation journey, across an organization?
I think metrics are very important. They are especially important at a product team level. So before we get to sort of what we look at a portfolio level, if you go into each of your individual product teams, they have to be clear on what the definition of done is and what the definition of good is. And you use that as your metric for each of the individual product teams. So what is it we are trying to achieve from an absolute outcome perspective for this feature that we're building or for this channel that we look after? And you use that as an example. And then at an organizational level, I think the measures there become slightly less tangible, but no less important. So things like whether we do have better collaboration and understanding across technology and business. And the way in which you measure that is how many times you return something after it's been done. Because if teams are really working together, then by the time they deliver an MVP, it's going to be in sort of a release ready state. So whether our MVPs are ready to release to customers is a good one to use at a more portfolio level. The number of times we return on designs, on customer journeys, on user stories is another one. So like when we go back and rework them, it indicates that that's not working. But actually, if I had to narrow that down to one thing, it would be, once you've started on this journey, a year later, are you still following Agile principles? If you are, no matter what the sub-metrics are, your Agile transformation journey has been a success. If you have reverted back to sort of going, no, we can't do this, we want to deliver a project, then you know that you have some more work to do.
In line with that, Saret, this probably reflects some of that messiness of reality. So the question from Mo is really around, in that Agile transformation journey, is it a typical thing or is it an unusual thing to have a bit of a hybrid going on? So traditional teams alongside Agile teams at the same time?
I think that if we are implementing, if you are a startup, you are going to have pure Agile, you're going to have pure Agile product teams. If you are a large technology company, you will have the same thing. If you are anybody else, you will have a hybrid. And there are a few reasons for this. The entire organization can't transform at the same pace. And some areas of your business, you might not want to transform into more Agile ways of work. There are really good reasons, for example, to let your core infrastructure teams who look after your data centers and your hardware work in a very deliberate way, in a deliberate pattern. And getting your Agile teams to work effectively with those other teams is very important. But I think if we work on a premise that says eventually everybody will be Agile, we're probably also setting ourselves up for failure. So 100% in my experience, it's mostly been hybrid. And that's why that portfolio piece is so important. And thinking about how you get your product teams to work with the rest of the business requires thought and can't just be allowed to work itself out organically.
Great. I think in most of our consulting around Agile transformations, we stress the point that Agile is really about the people within the organization and the approach and the work between those people in a collaborative fashion. So that goes to our question from Malusi, which is, what is the role of people and culture in the success of Agile transformation?
Okay. I think it is the most important role, Malusi. I think that if you don't get the people piece right, and that's why I started with that as well, if you don't get the people piece right, you are not going to get any of it right. And interestingly, as you mature on your Agile journey, this is also going to start affecting how you measure your teams, because you are going to have cross-functional people working together for a specific outcome. And the way in which you measure them is they have to have team KPIs as well. So Agile journeys are really, really successful when teams work together and they truly collaborate. So if you are going to measure each individual on something different and based on the individual success of their role, you're probably not going to get them to collaborate as effectively as you want to. So thinking about what your team KPIs are beyond the individual KPIs is critical. And the people change part of this is absolutely paramount. And I see Malusi had a follow-up question there, which talks about how other functions can use the Agile methodology. And you absolutely can. I mean, I think that a lot of our conversations are around digital and technology because that's where it started. But in one of my previous roles, what we actually did was we took the chief operating office area and we transformed that to work in an Agile way. Even though there was no development being done or it wasn't a traditional kind of function, but we said we want to take the principles of what Agile can give us and apply them in non-technical delivery teams. And it's the same principle. Think about your groups of people who have to work together towards a specific outcome. Define more Agile ways of working where they work with each other, they co-locate if that's possible, they work off single backlogs. Those are things anybody can do. You don't have to be in a tech team to do that.
Great, thank you, Saret. Related to that, probably from Samantha, it's a bit of a longer bit in terms of distilling it to a question on my side, and I guess Samantha is going towards the implementation of change in terms of how you go about it. And from Samantha, In Samantha's experience, a top-down and bottom-up approach is vital, but this leaves middle management out. And Samantha's found that the middle managers are always then an impediment to the transformation. So perhaps it's a question of, is that your experience, that it kind of brackets in from the top of the organization and the bottom up where Agile is in place? And do you find there's a particular group within organizations that typically then are challenged by the changes that are being brought in?
I think that if you were rolling out this methodology that said we're only going to have individual product teams, sort of in that very, very pure Agile way, this could become a thing. But the reality is that because we are fitting it into existing companies, existing organizations, that, like from my experience, that middle management layer is actually quite important. And it's about the role that you give them in that transformation. So if you use the model that I spoke about at the beginning, which is that Spotify one, somebody needs to lead these chapters. So you still need a manager to make sure that your business analysts are the best business analysts they can be, regardless of which product team they work in on a daily basis, or your architects all follow similar architecture principles, regardless of which product team they're working in on a daily basis. And where I've seen that middle management layer be applied quite successfully in the past is in those kind of roles. So you get the lead chapters. They think about how we apply consistent principles in our different product teams. And there is still a people management role. So this is actually something which we've grappled with in the past. And I'll tell you what answer I've arrived at every time I've had this is, there's this question that says, if a product team is going to be this cross-functional team who works together on a specific thing, like whether that's a channel or a business function or whatever, it doesn't really matter. And there's going to be developers in there and designers in there and a product owner in there. Is the product owner the manager of the team? And in my experience, that actually doesn't work, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get to a place where everybody comes to the table with their individual expertise and they collaborate to achieve an outcome. The minute somebody in that team is the manager of the team, we defer to the person that's the highest in the hierarchy. So we all go, okay, well, if that's what the manager wants, whoever that is, whether that's the product owner or someone else, it breaks down some of that creativity and some of that collaboration. So what we've done in the past was we sort of aligned it so that your line management function is somebody who understands your role in a team. Like, for example, a manager looking after the business analysts or a manager looking after specific technology development teams, so that your line management role actually sits outside of the product team. And that's hugely successful, because when you then go to your product team, everybody's on equal footing, everybody's delivering, but you do have a line manager who takes care of your career in terms of career path.
Thanks, Saret. And some really great questions coming through here. And Michelle is onto the question which relates to the pounds, euros, dollars, or rands, whichever might be the one that you're working with. And her question is, what, if any, changes were there in your funding models for a portfolio of projects when transitioning from traditional to agile ways?
Interestingly, there was a big change management and people element to that as well, because you do have to get your finance and your PMO teams to think about how you fund change in a different way. So in a traditional model, you have a portfolio of projects. All of those projects have a cost, and that rolls up to your overall project budget for the year. In an agile way, because you're moving, so the biggest change is that you would then move from project funding to product team funding. And it's quite simple to determine the cost of a product team because they are like ring fenced, right? You know what's in it. And so instead of trying to fund the project or come up with a funding, like a number for your project, you go, this is the cost of a team who is going to deliver change for this channel or this capability over the next year. And sort of that's step one. And then you start looking at how many sprints do they need to deliver specific features. And then you have a look at all of those features make up a change that you want to implement for your business, which is like a portfolio level program. And that becomes the cost of the program. But it requires a mindset shift. And I have actually found that that was one of the bigger challenges, because you're really breaking something which is very well understood and has lived for a very long time. But if you don't do that, you're always going to have this friction between your agile product teams and your PMO or your finance teams who look after project funding, because they're just going to be speaking different languages.
Thank you, Saret. And here's probably something from Moz that I think is an experience of everybody the world over at the moment that is tired of Zoom sessions. Although thank you for joining our session today. We appreciate that you weren't too tired to do that. But his question relates to, how do you manage change fatigue when entering an organization?
Okay, I see. I want to highlight specifically the second part of the question, which is that the company has employed consultancy after consultancy time and time again with no real improvement in their daily working lives. And that's why I said it's so important to not make it about some methodology that someone is trying to get you to implement. That never feels natural. It never fits into your organization as well as when you're just doing it yourself. So where we will often need help because we don't necessarily have all of the roles that we need in our agile journey. For example, if you're starting out brand new, you probably don't know what a product owner is, so someone has to come tell you what that is, and you might not have any scrum masters, so you might need to bring them in from outside as an example, right? But the actual agile transformation has to be your teams trying this on their own, not because some consultant is trying to get them to deliver in a different way. Because when teams start feeling the impact of that change and how much better they work together when they start working in a different way, that solves the fatigue. But this can't be, and I like the question earlier, which says that it has to be top down and bottom up. And we always have to have partners who help us on these journeys, especially if it's brand new. I think that's relevant. But the most critical part is your teams have to try this themselves through trial and error and learn as they go and define what works for them and what doesn't. Because you're right, if you approach it in any other way where it's done to people as opposed to them choosing to do something, you will just have change fatigue.
And hopefully Moz will drop in a comment there as well that goes, none of those numerous consultancies were DVT to date. And if he wants to really get it right, then he'll have DVT come in to do that.
Yeah, I was thinking about like the context of a DVT session as I answered that. But no, I mean, I do believe that working with the right people is important if you don't have the skills in-house. But you have to have some sort of there has to be heart in it, in the people who are actually in these teams. Else we can bring in even DVT and it won't work.
I will relate a last bit here from Zane in terms of his question, which perhaps comes to a bit of the conclusion around where we are at the moment on agile transformation journeys, is that they require a significant change within an organization, and any change is normally difficult to achieve successfully, even more so when you are changing the paradigms an organization has traditionally experienced. The drive these days in terms of the requirement for rapid change and innovation and new creation or disruption in terms of industries that they're in or are entering in makes it that much harder for an organization to find its feet in a new way of working. More importantly, find the metrics that are then relevant and find the value out of the transformation, which sometimes isn't captured in traditional metrics like the return on investment, etc. It sometimes winds up being things that are far softer, but perhaps more telling. You might see a change in terms of your turnover, in terms of the number of employees within your organization, because the way of working is now one that's more collaborative and one where they find more joy in terms of what they do on a day-to-day basis. And that's where I was kind of interpreting Zane's question to kind of go, in the space and using those metrics, agile transformation requires a huge investment. But are there certain metrics in the organization that should be being considered these days that aren't the traditional metrics and still point to the value of what's being done?
I think that when you apply agile transformation principles, some of your existing metrics will shift, and that is how you prove it. So speed to market, the cost of change, because you're not building something for 6 months and then throwing it over a wall and realizing at that point that we actually built the wrong thing. So cost of change does get impacted by this. And with speed to market, I don't mean that agile teams are faster. That's a bit of a misnomer, but they deliver higher quality in a shorter period of time, which drives down cost. Customer satisfaction. A lot of the agile principles are around getting your customers to test things with you and telling you what they want as you go. So we've seen CSAT improvements as a result of this. So those are kind of real company metrics that actually move in a positive direction when you start doing things in a different way.
Fantastic, Saret. We're right on time at 12 o'clock, 10 back in London, UK side of the world. I would just like to take the moment, Saret, thank you so much for sharing your experience and expertise in the space. That really was fantastic coverage today in setting the platform around business agility, particularly at the program and portfolio level. I think the answers to the team in terms of the audience and what they've asked, fantastic insights again from your side. I think the comments that are coming up at the moment are indeed all thank you, thank you, thank you. Saret, on behalf of DVT and the audience today, thank you so much for giving up your time and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for attending,
Thanks,
everybody.